Hey everybody, this is Michael Bray. I'm at the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Institute down here at Wayne State University in Detroit. Thank you all for joining us this evening. This is the first in our series of special interest forums. We have two speakers in addition to our moderator this evening. And towards the end of the session, we'll have a question and answer session.
Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first special interest forum on intelligence testing and assessment. And I am the director of the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Institute at Wayne State University, and we're what's called a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, or a UCED. And we're part of a national network of University Centers of Excellence that are all federally mandated through the Developmental Disabilities Act. And so every state and U.S. territory has at least one UCED. So the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities for the state of Michigan is the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Institute, or MyDDI, at Wayne State. And our mission is to contribute to the development of inclusive communities and quality of life for people with disabilities and their families. And we serve people with all types of disabilities across the lifespan and across the state, and really the nation. Today's special interest forum was prompted or motivated by a showing. We had a premiere of the documentary Intelligent Lives that we hosted at Wayne State University October 18th in partnership with Wayne State University's College of Education. And Mike, can you, yeah, go back, thanks. And I don't know, I hope all of you have seen the film, but if you haven't, I suggest you know, it's definitely worth seeing. And the film is very thought-provoking and raises a lot of important topics. And it follows three young adults with intellectual disabilities. One of them is Micah Fialka-Feldman, who is from Michigan. He went to Berkeley High School, and I think many of you may know him. And or his mother, Janice Fialka, who is a social worker and a parent, who's also featured in the film. And as I mentioned, the film raises many weighty topics and in some ways raises more questions than answers. So in order to do a deeper dive on some of these topics, we've scheduled a series of these special interest forums. And we know that from the premiere and other times that we've shown a trailer of the film, it raised a lot of discussion around what is intelligence and around intelligence testing and assessment, which is why we picked this for our first topic. And I'm very happy to say we have two esteemed presenters this evening who will help us unpack this important topic and continue our conversation on intelligence testing and assessment. So if you can go to the next slide, Mike. Great. So our first presenter is Dr. Jennifer Larson. Dr. Larson is a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist and clinical assistant professor and member of the pediatric faculty group in the Division of Rehabilitation Psychology and Neuropsychology at the University of Michigan. She provides comprehensive outpatient and inpatient neuropsychological assessments to diverse and complex child clinical populations with a broad spectrum of developmental, medical, and neurological conditions. David Taylor is our second presenter, is a self-advocate and peer support mentor committed to advancing the rights of people with disabilities. David has been an active member of Michigan Partners for Freedom and is trained as a local leader to help advance self-determination for individuals in the lives of all people with disabilities. David serves on the Community Advisory Council for MyDDI at Wayne State University. He's also a board member of the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council and was instrumental in organizing the 2013 project Beyond Tokenism, People with Complex Needs in Leadership Roles. And I could keep going on and on, but the last thing I'll say is that David is a TASH board member, which is a national organization, and chair of their self-advocacy committee. So before we begin with our presenters, I wanted to share some statistics that were shown in the film. Thanks, Mike. So the film is narrated by Chris Cooper, who is an actor. And in the narration, Chris Cooper says that 49 of 50 states still use intelligence testing as one of the tools to determine whether a student carries the label of intellectual disability. Only 17% of students with intellectual disability are included in the regular classrooms. Just 15% of the 6.5 million Americans with intellectual disability are employed. And then later in the film, Chris Cooper also states that research has shown that IQ testing results can be biased by factors such as socioeconomic status and cultural backgrounds, with African American students being almost twice as likely to be classified with an intellectual disability. So obviously, these are very disturbing statistics, so this is why we want to unpack this topic. So Dr. Larson, we'd like to start with you. And could you please give a brief overview of how IQ testing assessment is used today?
Yeah, certainly. Let me get I have a PowerPoint. Hold on one second here. So I'm going to talk about intelligence testing in the 21st century. So just to start, there was definitely a history that was reported in Intelligent Lives, and I really appreciated this movie. I think that it had a lot of wonderful things that it discussed, it showed, and I think that while very provocative, I think it's really important stuff to talk about. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to get to talk, and I'm very happy to discuss this when the question and answer time comes up. So, they definitely present a pretty ugly history of intellectual assessment, and it is largely accurate. There are some things that intellectual assessment has certainly been used for. However, there has been a lot of advancement in psychology, and there's been a lot of things that have changed as to how these measures are used, developed, and interpreted. So until about 1970, intelligent measures really only provided a single number to reflect something called general intelligence. And this was alluded to a little bit in the film. And since then, intelligence measures have been incorporated a different factor structure. So there's lots of different things that go in intellectual functioning. It's not just a single number. And I think to reflect intelligence as a single number is, it really misrepresents how I think a lot of psychologists and hopefully people really think about intelligence. And so that's what I'm really here to talk about, and how intellectual assessments are still used a lot, but there's a lot of different ways to interpret them and to think about the information that they give us. Before I go into more information about that factor structure, I think that this is something that's important to consider. So this is a quote from Jastrow in 1935. The IQ is a useful wedge and no more. It is only by having limitations of the test constantly in mind that they can be validly applied. And I think that this is a really important piece here, that it is a wedge. It's a wedge of somebody. It's a wedge of what we know about people. And it doesn't tell the whole story. So just to kind of back us up a little bit, so how do intelligence tests work? And I'm going to kind of broaden this, that this is intelligence tests, but also a lot of different kind of tests that are used to look at skills and abilities. So they work by comparing a child or adult to their age group, to their similarly aged peers. And they look across demographic factors with respect to the potential for intellectual achievement. So this is shows a little bit of statistics here, but what we expect, I think you guys should be able to see my pointer. The expectation is that about 68% of folks are going to fall what we call within kind of that average range. Then we expand a little bit to 95% of folks are going to fall somewhere within 2 standard deviations of that. And then we also have tails on both ends, where the remaining 5% of people are going to fall on one end or the other. And so that's how intelligence tests work, is that they are comparing children and adults to other peers that are the same age on the same types of tests to get a sense of where people fall based on their age. So the current factor structure, so I'm going to talk about kind of the 2 most well-known types of intellectual testing. So one is the WISC, or the Wechsler tests. So these are for children. There's an adult version as well. But as I mentioned previously, there was just this IQ score, this G, which is general intelligence. Now it's broken down to look at more factors. So the most recent edition, which has been out for about 4 or 5 years, looks at verbal comprehension as an area, so your verbal reasoning skills, so how one reasons using language. Visual spatial skills, so that's reasoning, looking at pictures, being able to see how different shapes go together to make larger shapes, being able to rotate shapes. a fluid reasoning, which is, the name fluid reasoning is a bit tricky to understand, but it's really this idea of nonverbal reasoning. So being able to not just look at pictures and manipulate them, but being able to see sequences and patterns. And so the best way to think about it is really this kind of nonverbal reasoning. And then you've got working memory, which is your ability to get information in and hold on to it and do something with that information. And then processing speed, so how quickly or rapidly you're able to process information. So the way I like to kind of think about this is we've got general reasoning skills. These first three are kind of our more reasoning. And then we have efficiency on this side. And so it holds similar for the adults as well, the adult assessment. So you again have similar factors. And then the other test is the Stanford Binet. So this was one that was actually mentioned in Intelligence Lives. And similarly, again, it used to be a single score, but now it's best understood by these kind of factor scores. So again, you have fluid reasoning, you've got knowledge, you've got quantitative reasoning, visual spatial processing, and working memory. And so on the Stanford Binet, rather than having verbal and nonverbal measures in the factors, they have domains. So each of these areas is assessed both verbally and non-verbally. So that way you can get information about verbal fluid reasoning, verbal knowledge, verbal quantitative reasoning, etc. And you can also get that information based on non-verbal domains. So one thing that I really want to highlight throughout this is that a full-scale IQ, or that IQ number, it's a number. It doesn't tell the whole story. We were talking to David earlier, and he said, it's important to not judge a book by its cover. And I think that is one of the biggest take-homes here, and that is a huge thing. And so when is it appropriate to talk about a full-scale IQ? And in all honesty, a lot of times it is not reflective, because the most important thing that we look at with all of our different tests and measures and within intellectual functioning is that it really identifies strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't necessarily give the best overall picture, but oftentimes you get a pattern of peaks and valleys, because everybody has strengths, everybody has things that they're good at, everybody has things that are a little bit harder for them. And so this is just an example. So here I've got a graph, I've got a couple of graphs I'm going to go through. So this box right here denotes the average range. And so these are just some scores for a fellow named James. These are made up scores. But so this guy, he received a 130, so well above average on his verbal stuff. His nonverbal reasoning was a little bit weaker. Our working memory fell kind of right there in that average range, but our processing speed was much lower. So if we think about looking at a full-scale IQ, we would get something that would fall out at 100. But that doesn't really describe James's strength in his verbal reasoning. It doesn't talk about his weaknesses that might be present in nonverbal skills. And it also doesn't talk about that processing and efficiency, where we might have some really strong skills, but we're a little bit slower to process information, so just need a little bit more time to respond. So by looking more at the breakdown, that tells me a whole lot more about each individual person. It also tells me about what things can I start thinking about for accommodations. How can I help James be more successful in his environment? So just to kind of speak, so reporting the full-scale IQ here is not appropriate. It's also not appropriate in this example, where we have Sally, whose verbal skills are falling well below what we would expect, whose visual spatial skills are kind of broadly in that average to low average range. Our nonverbal reasoning is right there in that average range, as is our working memory, but our processing speed is similarly quite low. So if we look at her intellectual functioning, if we look at that FSIQ, or that overall number, again, we're not getting a nice picture of her strengths and weaknesses. So that's where it's really important to consider all aspects, these factors, when thinking about intellectual assessment. So when is it appropriate? It's a little bit more appropriate when our scores hang together. So for this person, our scores are almost all falling in that average range, so that IQ is probably more reflective of their skills. Similarly, for this person over here, whose skills are falling more consistently together and we're seeing kind of overall weaknesses. So again, it's not always appropriate to talk about a full-scale IQ, and I feel like sometimes, and oftentimes, I have heard from people and patients and families that I'm working with that all they have is a number, and that number, again, does not always reflect strengths and weaknesses. So aside from those factors that I just talked about, the other thing to think about is what else goes into interpreting IQ scores. This is critical, and this is something that in the right hands, this tool can be very, very, very helpful. But if we're really just talking about a single number, we're not incorporating all of the other things that could go into interpreting IQ scores. And again, I'm going to broaden this, not to just IQ scores, but scores more broadly. So these are not divided up by any percentage other than just to show that there are lots of things that go into it. So effort and motivation is a huge thing. Test engagement. If somebody's not interested in participating in the test or aren't engaged in the testing, then it's really, really hard to know, am I really actually accurately measuring skills and abilities? Or am I measuring something else? Anybody can do poorly on a test. It's really important to make sure that you're measuring what it is that you intend to be measuring. Another big one is motor skills. So a lot of our tests require a paper and pencil or require that you manipulate blocks and put them together. If motor skills are a challenge, if there's impairments in motor skills or that it's harder to manipulate things, then most certainly we're not assessing what we're intending to assess. Same thing with language skills. If our language skills, if we're having a hard time understanding task instructions, or if we're having a hard time responding to the tasks, then again, we're not measuring what the skill is intending to be measuring, but instead we're measuring our basic language skills. Similarly, if we are assessing somebody who's not a native English speaker, that's a whole other thing here where we have to think about. Age at test is something else to think about, because when we think about intellectual skills, we do think about stability, that after about age 7 or 8, we kind of expect that intellectual skills are going to be somewhat stable. There's, of course, going to be ups and downs. On any given day, we're going to see different performances, but that over time that there should be a similar pattern of strengths and weaknesses. However, in those younger children, there is a lot of variability, and so there's less stability in those intellectual skills in those children that are under, I would say, about 7 or 8 years of age. Attention is a huge one, because if we're inattentive, if we're not attending to the right information, if we're distracted, then we're not going to be able to perform as well as we, to really be able to get a sense of what our true strengths and weaknesses are, or really are we testing somebody's abilities? And then lastly, what is our normative sample? If our normative sample, I know that Sharon, you had mentioned the statistics where African Americans are identified more often as being cognitively impaired. If we do not have different normative samples, or if the normative sample that we're comparing to does not match the patient, then it's really challenging to know, what are we measuring here? There's a lot of different things that go into normative samples. And we need to be aware of our normative sample before using it to interpret test scores. So I think it's important to recognize that all of these things go into intellectual assessment. But the other thing to think about is that when we're thinking of what it is that we're doing with testing, sometimes the question is, are we looking at basic skills and abilities? Are we really looking at somebody's true knowledge? Are we really looking and being able to tap into that? Or are we looking more functionally? Because sometimes for a child, let's just say with attention deficit disorder, that's how they're functioning in the classroom. That's how they're functioning in the day-to-day environment. So that's another important piece to consider, because even if we're not looking at true skills and abilities, we might be looking at how a child is functioning in their school environment. And that's another big piece. Granted, we should also take caution in interpreting the score, but it gives us a lot of information to say, hey, we can really tell that that attention is impacting the ability to demonstrate skills and knowledge. So the other piece I just briefly wanted to talk about before turning it over to back to Sharon and David is intellectual disability. So I know that there was the statistics that 49 out of 50 states use an IQ assessment, and in all honesty, I'd be curious to know what that other state does. Our statistic manual that we use for diagnosing, utilizes intellectual assessment, so IQ, as well as adaptive skills, and I'm going to talk about adaptive skills in just a moment, to meet the diagnostic criteria for an intellectual disability. So I talked about intellectual skills, and again, it's really important to make sure that when we are making this diagnosis, that we truly feel like we have assessed skills and abilities, not just some of those other things that I've already talked about. And so when we think about adaptive skills, those really refer to your practical everyday skills that are required to function to meet the demands for your environment. The big point here is for your environment. There's a lot of variability across environments, across cultures. And so that's a big thing to also consider. So adaptive skills include things like communication, community use, functional academics, home living. I can't read the other one here, one's being blocked out. Health and safety skills, leisure skills, self-care, self-direction, social skills, motor skills, and then also work skills or vocational skills. All of these are things that we want to think about when we're functioning, because if we can have low adaptive skills, meaning that we could have a hard time functioning in these environments, but have normal intelligence. And it can also be flipped. We can have lower intellectual skills, but be functioning fine in our day-to-day environment. So it's really important to consider both of these together. And is there actual functional impairment or not? So again, many things go into adaptive functioning, and impairment in skills such as attention, motor, language, or executive functioning could affect these everyday skills, not just intelligence. So there's a lot of important things to consider rather than, again, just looking at that number. A number is a number, but really what goes into it is more than interpretation. It's that hopefully a relationship with a clinician that is not just assessing numbers, but instead assessing the whole person. And I think I'm gonna stop here for just a minute. And Sharon, I'm gonna cover some of this other stuff a little bit later on, if that's okay.
Sure, great.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Larson. So David, well, just to let you know that I just want to make sure that everyone knows we won't have, for our Q&A, this is a short session, so that I do believe our speakers have agreed that if we don't get to all the questions today, that we would be able to share those questions with our speakers, and we could post those answers on our website. So just so folks know, because I see some questions popping up that are excellent questions already in the group chat. So in the movie, Micah, and David, I know you know Micah, because he's from Michigan. Micah states that he saw a sheet of paper in the mail and that said he had a 40 IQ. And then Micah Googled what a 40 IQ is, and he said that he saw that it said that that would be somebody who really can't work a job or can't move from their parents' house, or things like that. So I just wanted to get a sense, David, what is your reaction to that statement that Micah made?
Sorry, that is a very sad and scary situation. Just because for you to even see that and have to look that up, and just for that to tell you exactly how your life is gonna be for the rest of your life, that is definitely that worries me, that a piece of paper with a test like that can tell you everything about of how your life is gonna be, and that's not even a true statement, just because we all know how Micah doing now. So that I think in society they make something big as, well, the scores matches the person, but they don't match the person, and it's always reflect on just, if they test one person, they reflect it onto everybody else. And I think they it needs to be more of an understanding as not everybody the same. Everybody disability, just because we might have an intellectual disability, our disability is totally different, and we do things differently than the other person would.
And David, I'm wondering, has IQ testing or similar kind of intelligence testing impacted your life?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I remember them telling me that I had a 30% IQ test, and I kind of looked at the lady like, so what's the 30%? And she was like, 30 and 20% IQ test is somebody that who can't work, who doesn't have the social skills, and also doesn't have the memory to even be in society. And I kind of looked at her like, well, you saying that kind of people don't even fit me, because all that stuff don't even codify. So I must not be codified in the work then. So for me, the work is kind of, it's a miracle then. So yeah, I definitely I had that experience before. I had it more than once of going to school and getting tested for the IQ, and then doing other stuff. When kind of the state tests you sometimes when you go to MCTI, they test you for that school to go to that school, and they test you for the IQ score. And I kind of looked at that score as a joke sometimes, just because it doesn't give you the real person, who the person really is. It just tells you if the person needs help with, but it affects everything you do in society.
And do you feel, David, that you've been limited in any way by your test scores? I know you, so I know all you do, but I mean, do you feel that there were limitations that you experienced, whether in school or pursuing work, that limited you?
Yeah. So one of the things that I did was it did limit me to do a lot of stuff in school, but especially at work. It limited me to actually have the opportunity to learn certain things at work and not ask for help. So it kind of it put barriers sometimes, because it affected me going to school and me not having the confidence and just didn't want to people to help me with certain things. So it made me kind of pretty much be depressed sometimes when a person tell you that your scores are that, and you know that ain't true, but in your mind you like, well, it means I can't learn nothing, or I can't comprehend, I'm not good to be in society. So I would just stay home then. So it kind of made me realize that a lot of that stuff, the barriers that I go through now, it was because a lot of from the IQ scores.
Thank you for sharing that, David. And Dr. Larson, I don't know if you want to respond. I had a question for you, Dr. Larson, but I don't know if you have any comment to David, or if I...
Yeah, I think that's a really, I think, David, what you said is very strong, and I think that's a huge piece, is how is information conveyed? To who? Are you a part of that information or not? Does it fit with who you feel like you are? And also, I think it's important that when strengths and weaknesses and supports and kind of all of those things are discussed with people, it's important to think about them as a whole person. It is not just, again, this is not, when I work with families and I talk to families, and oftentimes I talk with children and young adults about this information, and a lot of it is, I don't give just a number, because that is not helpful, because there are so many strengths and so many things that everybody brings to the table, and it's really important to think about how do we foster those strengths to support some weaknesses, and how do we create an environment that everybody's going to be successful in.
Thank you. And Dr. Larson, a follow-up question to you. Can you share some of the promising advancements in intelligence testing and assessment, and how these advancements might help address some of the concerns and those statistics that we raised earlier?
Yeah, I certainly can. I have some additional slides. Do you want me to go ahead and go through those?
Yeah, please. And then we'll open it up to questions and answers.
Yep, sounds good. It is, hang on, okay, there we go. So I think that these limitations are huge. They are very important to consider. And they're significant, and that these tests, when we think about across different cultures, education, race, and linguistic abilities, they are not necessarily, they're not always measuring the same things. There's a lot of bias. And this includes measurement bias. So when we think about measurement bias, are we actually really measuring the thing that we're trying to measure? So when I talked about with the language, if we have somebody who has receptive language difficulties and we're asking them to respond to a verbal task or asking them to complete something that's kind of complex, and they're not understanding what we're asking, is it because they're not able to do the task? Or is it because they're not understanding what we're asking them to do? And is there another way that we can help get that across? Similarly, there's not necessarily always equal opportunity for access to knowledge, skills, and abilities that are being measured. So for example, exactly what Chris Cooper had talked about, these factors are related to age, to socioeconomic status, to cultural background, to disability, to language proficiency. And all of these should be playing a role in deciding what tests to use. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, because there are some tests that are less demanding on certain things. And so that it is really important to consider what test is being used, as well as what normative sample to be using. Also, as a clinician, how do you interpret it? Are you interpreting the right thing? And then also something just to think about, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but just quality versus quantity of education. We all know that depending on different educational systems, there's different education going on. And so that's another piece. Again, thinking about test bias, and is our test tapping into what we're expecting it to tap into or not? So how do we make tests accessible? So for adults, there are demographically adjusted norms. So they take into account age, race, and years of education. So this is an effort to equate scores to be able to minimize misclassifying individuals as cognitively impaired. So that's one step. I think that that's still a long shot to really address a lot of the difficulties, but at least it certainly helps to identify and recognize that there are some differences. Also, for both adults and children, we can use measures that are less likely to be culturally influenced, as well as using measures that have less language or motor demands depending on the need of the patient. We can accommodate within standardized procedures by using interpreters, making pictures larger for those that have visual impairment, changing configuration of test material to make it easier to access. Also, not all clinicians do this, but those clinicians that I feel like understand disability and understand really this understanding of strengths and weaknesses, after giving a standardized assessment, which has a lot of rules and limitations where we can't re-say things, where we can't rephrase, where we have to respond in a very certain way, but we can then test outside of standardization. We can test one's limits to really get a sense of where their skills and abilities are. And this is a really important thing, and it takes it beyond, and then we're able to actually communicate about where a person is functioning. So Michigan, the University of Michigan has something called the Michigan Adaptive Cognitive Assessment Laboratory. And this is something that is pretty unique, and it is, I think, a really great resource for a lot of families out there. So traditional neuropsychological testing, and I'm going to say intellectual testing also, is organized around working with patients who can readily participate in cognitive testing. But that basically means that it's not always designed for patients with the greatest need for assessment, often requiring those verbal responses, requiring manipulation of stimuli, so blocks or pegs or something like that, and also looking at time of response, so motor response is a common measure of ability. And so the focus of this lab is really accessibility for all. It was developed in 2002 by my colleague Seth Warchowski, and then it's also now Dr. Kaufman who contributed these slides. She is a person who does a lot of these evaluations and assessments. This lab was really developed out of parent frustration for patients with severe motor speech impairment, as they did not believe that this was a fair way to test skills if we can't really tap into them. So it's really based out of several different grants that were received and utilizing assistive technology and augmentative communication devices. So this is just a real brief example of what it is that we do, but how do we make things accessible? So we utilize larger switches, we utilize fewer choices, a yes-no response. There's a lot of different ways where if we don't have a lot of use of our hands, we can utilize different kind of head controls, so switches on the side of the head, voice control. We can also assess eye movements, where we can see where somebody is looking, and depending on how long they're looking, then that's their response. And we have been able to look at this compared to our normal measures, and we found that this is psychometrically an okay way to look at skills in certain areas. So just my big takeaways: in the right hands, intelligence measures are one tool, and I'm going to emphasize one. It is a single tool to help clarify one's cognitive abilities, potentials, strengths, and weaknesses. Like many other tools, particularly in medicine, it should not be used alone because rarely does it stand independently. It's also important to recognize that just because a tool says something, it's important that we have to think about it. We have to see, does this make sense? Does it fit? I would have to argue that if, with regard to some of the reports of intellectual numbers that were given up, I would have to say that I would challenge probably that person who gave those numbers, because clearly it does not explain somebody's functioning. It's important to use the right tools to gain an understanding of one's skills and abilities. If we are using the wrong tool, then we're not really actually measuring what it is that we intend to measure. Importantly, testing is far more than putting people into pejorative categories. The tests that we do, including intellectual tests, help to clarify diagnoses. They help to gain a better understanding of brain behavior relationships and specific areas of brain functioning. For example, they're used in working with understanding where memory or language is located for surgical procedures, so that way we really leave brain areas intact. It can also help inform clinical treatment recommendations. And importantly, for the things that I do, it really helps to inform educational and vocational treatment recommendations. So as a neuropsychologist who regularly uses intellectual assessment and intellectual tools as part of my daily practice, my goal with any age child is to help him or her to become the most competent, confident, and independent adult possible. Even if I'm working with a little 3 or 4-year-old, I like to think about the big picture. And I'm hopeful that anybody in my profession is also doing that we're not looking just right here, but we're looking at how do we help anybody become as successful as possible. It varies significantly depending on child and family goals. So some families really want inclusion. Sometimes inclusion is more appropriate than others, depending on what is available in the different communities. It's always a collaboration with the family, the educational system, and the community, and the child, based on their needs and their goals. Through neuropsychological assessment, I'm able to work with families to identify how best to accomplish their goals and work towards identifying resources that will best fit each child and family's needs. And so for me, these are the biggest takeaways. I'm going to go ahead, and I think that's the end of my slideshow.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Larson. And before we go to the questions and answers, I just want to make sure, David and Jen, is there anything that you wanted to share that that before we go into questions and answers?
I do, actually. So Jen, I had a question. So I was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. And during high school, before at the age of 4, I was diagnosed with cognitive impairment. So I was diagnosed with cognitive impairment, but I guess when I got older, I was diagnosed with mild. And the reason I'm figuring out, so there was a lot of things, and I didn't share this with you and Sharon or Michael, is that when I was told that I couldn't learn, I was told by the school or by some people that I could never ever learn all over again. So I had to teach myself how to learn things all over again. And my question to you is that when a person that has cognitive impairment, when they get diagnosed with that, is there any way that they can retest themselves and see is there more to it?
Certainly. I mean, there's always an opportunity to get second opinions. Again, there's this idea that intellectual skills are stable to some degree, but also that, as I mentioned, that there's a lot of different ways of thinking. I mean, the data is the data, but there's a lot of different things that go into that interpretation. And so certainly you can get reassessed and get a sense of, compared to where you are right now. I mean, we expect that everybody's going to continue to learn and grow and develop and gain new skills and figure things out. And again, it's that diagnosis of intellectual impairment or cognitive impairment really comes from those comparisons between those functional skills, as well as compared to your peers within these domains of those ones that I had talked about at the beginning, those factors. How are you functioning compared to your peers? And it's hard because it doesn't mean that you're not going to learn. It doesn't mean that you're not going to grow, that you're not going to do things, be amazing things. But again, that's kind of where that diagnosis comes from. And so it's really understanding that.
How do I get tested again? That's the question I've been wanting to figure out. How would I be able to test myself all over again to see where I'm at? And is there more stuff that I don't know now?
Certainly. So, I mean, there's a lot of different places where you can go through and different types of tests. A lot of times you'd have to have a referral from a doctor that says, to reassess. The other place is I know that we've been doing a lot of work with Michigan Rehabilitation Services.
Oh, okay. MRS?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And so if you go through MRS, I don't know what county, I've been working a lot with the Washtenaw County reps and folks through here, but they definitely can probably get you in the right direction, because a lot of times also it's helpful because it's figuring out what are those strengths and weaknesses, and where can you really find a place that you're going to feel good at doing things and being successful. And so it's identifying some of those skills and helping you to figure out where things are going to be best for you.
Okay, so I probably get in touch with the Oakland County MRS office.
Yeah, that's the way that I would go. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate. Like I'm happy to share my email with you, and we can figure things out as well, and I can help you get
yeah, right. I would definitely love that.
Okay.
Thanks. Great question, David. We're going to open it up for questions now, and Mike, I'll let you facilitate that, and we'll take questions till about 5:02 so that we can have 5 minutes to wrap up and make sure that we end on time. And again, if there are more questions than we have time, we'll take those questions and get them to our speakers, and then make sure we get answers posted. So we're ready for the first question.
Sure. If you'd like to ask a question, you can click the raise your hand button that should be located at the bottom of your Zoom screen under participants, I believe. And I will unmute you and you can ask your question, or you can type it in the chat bar, and we have a couple that were typed in earlier. I think this one was for you, Jen. Michelle asked, what about visual acuity? And I think you were talking about the different domains of intelligence. So.
That's a really big one, because clearly if we have visual impairment, whether it be acuity or convergence or lots of different things, that could certainly impact your visual perception, your ability then to interpret the stimuli that's presented to you. And so it's something that anybody who's doing testing with a child or an adult should really get a sense of how is vision, how is hearing. So it's really checking all those basic sensory things. Also, is somebody colorblind? Because some of our stimuli is colorful, and that could certainly impact testing. And so it's being very knowledgeable of all of these different sensory pieces, because that's how our information gets in and then processed.
One other one was, what groups is Wechsler normed for? And Sarah helped us out with that. She did post in here as many, the different groups, studies that were targeted for validity studies using WIS.
Certainly, and I think one thing I just wanted to speak to on that
is,
so, the thing, they definitely are normed for, there is some norming for special groups. There is some norming for traumatic brain injury. There is some norming for different developmental disabilities. But the other thing is that the purpose of that intellectual test is to really, it compares to kind of what we consider neurotypical or typically developing individuals who don't have any known medical difficulties or disabilities. And again, just as a standardized sample to see, compared to your peers that have no known difficulties, how are you performing? Where are you in different skills?
Thank you. We have another question from Jen O'Connor. She asks, what do you do in your county is automatically segregating kids from day one? Parents don't know the laws, and when kids are sent away to segregated schools, the parents often live in that bubble for life. Non-inclusive schools equates to communities. So I think, Jen, what you're asking about is maybe some strategies or how to go about perhaps seeking further testing to prevent that.
Yeah, so Jen, I mean, I think that this is something that is really challenging because it is very dependent on every educational system and county as to what type of inclusion or not inclusion. I know that there's a lot of places here in Michigan where their mild cognitive impairment classes, the MIC program, is in an entirely different building. And so this idea of having, you know, a self-contained or a classroom that addresses individuals' needs, but then also allows for mainstreaming opportunities and possibilities doesn't exist. And so I think that that's a real challenge. And so I feel like that's a really big problem where if we're segregated immediately and we're in an entirely different campus or an entirely different building, that's not helping anybody. But I'm also, you know, I do think that there is a place at times for having those self-contained classrooms where there is that specific help to meet a child's needs or a person's needs at a level where they're at and progress them forward, but then at the same time being able to integrate into mainstream populations in lots of other ways to be able to support all areas of development.
And I just wanted to add that I think that it is very likely that one of our special interest forums will talk about inclusive education. Great. Because it's that's another one of those really meaty topics that needs to be unpacked. So thank you for that question. It's a really important.
Yeah, I think so too.
David, I have a question for you from Janet. Her question is, why do you want to get retested now that you are a leader of a movement, can do a lot of activities, and that the test is just going to reinforce a negative stereotype on truth? The truth is you have done so much in your life, more than most. So I guess why would you want to be retested now at this point in your life?
Because I was always curious of the scores that I had before. So I'm just curious of what scores would they even put me up with. I want to know more about. I know about my disability, but I want to know a lot more about it. Like that way, I can help other people who went through what I went through. It'd be more easier for the families and the person who's going through what I went through, when I didn't have that type of support or a person who knows so much about it, and to really help them go over that hump, and to really just make sure that for them not to be ashamed of having a disability or being depressed of if I can live in society or be in the community and all that. I just want to see more about. I want to look into more of my disability, but more as in to find other people that went through the same things I went through with the same disability.
So using that self-knowledge more as a tool for your advocacy now, right?
Yeah, to push it more, but also to get more knowledge on a lot more of it.
And David, I think that that's a really important point in a lot of ways, and I think that Janet points out you have done amazing things, but I think also that you're also seeking some kind of self-knowledge to some degree of where is this for me? And again, it helps with that advocacy piece.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it just shows me that I can it would just help me just push what I'm looking at more and more, and to really educate other people, but educate like lawmakers when they don't understand a person with an intellectual disability needs the same support as other disabilities as well, and to really push certain things, to really advocate and to help other people and mentor other people who went through the same struggles, or meet people the struggles I went through. They can help me some things, and we can work together.
Thanks. Do we have time, Mike, for one more quick question? I don't know if there is one. It would have to be real quick. Are there any other questions?
No more on the board right now, no.
Okay, great. So this will be a good time to bring up the next slide.
Is there a way that you and Jen I would love to get Jen contact her email so I can,
Oh,
because I'm definitely dying to really tap into certain things I didn't tap into yet, but not just that, but really to understand to learn more about my disability and to
Sure.
really figure out how to help other people with that same issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can definitely continue our conversation after. So for sure.
Okay. Holy crap.
So I wanted to just share with you some resources, and I'm hoping that that there are some links here, and this session will be recorded, so you'll have this. But the Intelligent Lives website has a number of really good resources at the national level. So we put the website there. We also have put the MyDDI link there with our links, some of the some national resources and Michigan resources. And we really hope this is the beginning of our relationship with you and that we'll continue the conversation through these special interest forums and beyond. And one that is on our the MyDDI website that I just wanted to pull out to bring attention to, because I think it will get some of the questions about inclusion and related to education, is the Michigan Alliance for Families. So that's a really great resource. So if you're not familiar with that one, please do check it out. And then, as Dr. Larson mentioned, that she's done some work with the Michigan Rehabilitation Services, and the information is there. And then, John, I believe you provided these two publications that have a lot of good information. So I think that, as I said, please feel free to reach out to MyDDI, and any other additional questions that come out after this, we'll try and get them answered on our website. So Mike, I think before you give some of the housekeeping things, I just wanted to say thank you to both of our presenters today for an excellent and very informative discussion. So thank you so much for kicking us off with this experience.
which brings us to the next one, which is Thursday, December 20th from 5 to 6. If you received the flyer for this session, the link to register for December 20th was also on that, but we'll be sending that out again as well to everyone who's on here tonight. And if you please, feel free to share this. We really hope that we get a wide variety of individuals interested in these topics to join us. If you have any questions about seeing the recording after December 1st, redeeming the social work CEs, my email is at the bottom of the screen here. Please email me anytime. Or if you have questions after the fact for our presenters, you can email those to me as well, and I'll be sure to pass those on to them. So with that, I think we are right at 6 o'clock. How about that? Again, thank you, David. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Sharon. Look forward to December 20th for our next topic.